Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and get started. She's trying to come back in here again? Yeah. Okay, tonight's lesson is obviously lesson 3. We're going to be looking at Exodus chapters 3 and 4. So quite a bit of things to go through. I'm confident that we're going to come across a couple things tonight that maybe you're not familiar with. There was some stuff in here I was like, I did not recall that whatsoever. Having studied, in years past, different things come across. I don't remember a couple things. One of them is actually quite shocking. And when we get to it, it's not going to be the most pleasant discussion, but you'll see when we get there. Interesting discussion between Moses and his wife, for sure. So, we begin with our lesson, page 1. The Pharaoh who sought Moses' life died, and the government policy of oppressing the Hebrews did not change. At this point, the people of God turned with one accord to the Lord. They groaned and cried out to God for help. 4 verbs stress the divine response. God heard their groaning. He remembered the covenant with the patriarchs. He looked on the Israelites and he was concerned about them. The divine concern was translated into concrete action when God called a prophet to be their deliverer. Of course, we know that was Moses. A new day dawned and everything had to change for Moses. When he went out with his sheep that morning, he had no idea that he would meet God. It pays to be ready, for we never know what God has planned for us. So a little context off the top of your heads. How old is Moses when it says on that day when he went out with his sheep that morning? How old was he? 80 years old. So he's 80 years. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, shots fired. All right. So I'm going to ask for some help tonight in reading verses. So if I could have someone to read chapter 3, verses 1 through 9, that would be wonderful. Who would do that? Wayne, thank you. Wayne's going to read that for us, chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So God appears to Moses in the course of his duties of tending Jethro's flock. Do you remember his other name? Reuel, Reuel. Now, is Jethro, what do we remember about that name? You remember about it? His name was Reuel, right? But Jethro was kind of more of a title. It was more of a title. So in the course of his duties, tending Jethro's flock, Moses came into the region of Horeb, the mountain of God. This mount may have been sacred already to the worshipers of the Lord. So this is a possibility. this mountain may have already been sacred. See, the reason why we say this is because it says the mountain of God there in verse 1. Now, the question is, why was it called that? And so I learned a new word. And so I learned a new word, so I'm going to learn you a new word. Right? And so here's the word. So on the other hand, the text may call the place the mountain of God proleptically. Now, anybody, I've come across quite a few words in my time, but the word proleptically I've never heard. Anybody heard that one before? Randy probably has. He knows all sorts of stuff. But proleptically, well, I've got a little definition there for you. Unfortunately, the hole punch caught it, but you can kind of see. Yeah, I've given you the definition. Yeah. You got okay. Yeah, you still typing in? Okay. All right, you don't trust what I looked up. All right, that's fine. All right, so on the other hand, okay, so Doc Smith here says proleptically, i.e. in anticipation of what would shortly transpire there. So now, proleptically means that you speak of something that is going to happen, but it already happened. It's a sure thing. So the representation or assumption of a future act or development as if presently existing or accomplished. So you're speaking as if something has already been accomplished in a present sense, even though it's a future thing. Proleptically. All right, so that's free of charge. So now, if somebody can work that into your daily life, in the next week or two, you get 10,000 points. So Horeb, though, when we said that mountain, it said came to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Horeb actually refers to a range of mountains. The particular peak where God appeared was known as Sinai. At that mount, the heavenly silence of 4 centuries was broken. Now, I don't know if you think of it like this, but we have 400 years where God has not spoken. 400 years. And you look back to Genesis 46 was the last time, and now 4 centuries of silence was broken, and God is speaking to Moses. Now, the angel of Yahweh, or the angel of the Lord, as it says, appeared to Moses in flames of fire from within a bush. Now, this was not something that was happening specifically just in Moses' mind. Okay? So, do we have that sort of thing taking place when God speaks to people? That he's just dealing with something, it's just dealing with them in their own minds. What do we call that? Visions, right? Or sometimes dreams. So, but this was an actual something. So if there was someone else hanging around, they might have perceived it as well. But Moses was the one who did see this. This was not a visionary or inner experience. What happened here cannot be explained on any naturalistic basis. So if it's outside of anything possible within the natural realm, then it must be defined as what? It's supernatural, a miracle. And in this case, it says, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. So this was what we call a genuine theophany. Okay, we've heard the word theophany. Can you guys give me another example of a theophany? Theophany. There's quite a few in the scriptures. Okay. So there was a fourth in there with them, right? Okay, that's a theophany? No, that would be a miracle. A theophany here is a manifestation of God. So this is God manifesting specifically in some specific way in order to reveal. So, Baptism of Jesus. So, as a dove, would that be a theophany? I'd have to think on that a little bit. What'd you say? Where it says you're talking about an angel? Okay, okay. All right, so a couple come to my mind right away. One is Balaam. Balaam and the donkey. Okay, what did the donkey see? Manifestation, and eventually, yeah, so Balaam, so we have different things like this. This is manifestation of God. Moses observed that while the bush was on fire, what caught his attention? It wasn't burnt up. It wasn't being consumed. So that really caught his attention. So it just wasn't on fire. It was not being consumed. And that is what caught his attention. And so he moved to take a closer look. And when he moved to take a closer look, he heard the voice of God speak 6 words. Now, not literally 6 actual words here. This is meaning 6 different, like a word meaning a saying. So, it's very interesting to think about the way that God chose to reveal himself here in this manner. It's very interesting. Because God just doesn't do things willy-nilly, does he? Seems to have multiple purposes behind what he does and how he does it. And so here we have God speaking to Moses a word of address. So God called Moses' name 2 times. Moses, Moses. Now it's interesting. Thus did God arrest the attention of the shepherd and at the same time indicate a personal acquaintance with him. So the fact that he called his name twice, there's, as I'm reading these passages, there's so much being described to really think about what it looked like and what was going through Moses' mind. I mean, I know you see something on fire immediately out in the wilderness, it's going to catch your eye, right? I mean, I can't think of any time I've ever been anywhere there was a fire and it didn't capture your attention. But then you start noticing things about it and you start investigating. And as you start investigating, what do you start doing? Start processing, right? And thinking on it. And like, what? Wait, what's going on here? Something's different here. Something's happening here. And he moves closer. And then he hears his name 2 times. That had to be quite a thing. And so this first word was a word of address, God addressing, and then a word of warning. Moses must come no closer. He was standing on holy ground in the presence of God. And so what was he instructed to do? Remove his shoes. Now, seems kind of unusual, but this is an interesting thing because this practice, for different reasons, is used in a lot of different places. The removal of shoes, right? Especially in Eastern culture, it's a thing of respect. It's something. I know some of you have traveled to the Far East. Anybody here been like to China or Japan for traveling for work? Okay. Did you have to remove your shoes a lot? Yeah. Makes you think twice about your socks, doesn't it? You're going to someone's house, and they don't let you wear your shoes. You're always like, I got to put on my good socks. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, right. And make sure you ain't got no holes. You put on your good socks. Make sure there's no holes in your. They ain't gonna let you wear your shoes in there. Or make sure they match too. That's another thing. Yeah. So anyway, he must show respect for this spot by removing his sandals. Sandals pick up dirt during a journey, and man must be clean when he approached God. So a word of address, a word of warning, and now a word of identity. the deity identified himself as the God of your father. Here, singular. There's other places in this text where it's God of your fathers, but here of your father. Now, would that catch his attention right off the bat? Why? Yeah, you guys remember who his father was? Remember their names? You remember their names? I'm putting it to you tonight. What's that? His wife is Zipporah, yeah. Jochebed. Amram and Jochebed were Moses' parents. And so, now think about this. When's the last time he's probably seen him? Been a while, right? So immediately, the God of your father, my father. Certainly that had to strike him. And the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And he knew that his people, where he knew what was going on in Egypt before he ended up out in Midian, right? And so he knew who Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were. Hearing this, Moses quickly hid his face. So to this point, he's figuring out what's going on here. Now he realizes, because he hides his face, for he knew that it meant death to look upon God. Not little g, not all those gods who he knew in Egypt, but Yahweh. So a word of address and warning and identity, and now a word of compassion. 4 precious indications of divine grace were given. God says, I have seen, I have heard their cry, I know, and I have come down. God is always concerned about the welfare of his people. And then from this bush, the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh, a word of promise. God promised to bring his people out of Egypt and bring them into a land flowing with milk and honey. Sounds good to me. But then things took a turn. So far, he's getting some information about Israel that's in bondage and that they're going to be delivered. A word of challenge. Moses was informed that he was being sent to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Here's this. See, at this point, Moses is probably rejoicing, thinking, this is great. This is wonderful news. God's about to deliver Israel. But then he heard the news that he was the deliverer. What? Come again? Can you imagine? Have you ever been stopped in your tracks by a statement that was something that you had to, could you please repeat that? That you were so shocked by what was happening? Just try for a second to think. You're hearing this news about the people that you've been away from now for over 40 years, and he obviously cared about them. It was his family. And they're going to be set free. He knew what the bondage was like. But then he hears he's going to be the one to deliver them. God uses human instruments to accomplish his work here on earth. There had been 80 years of preparation for Moses. Now it was time to act. Do you think he thought at this point in time that this was all preparation? Do you think as he was headed out that morning to tend the sheep, he's like, God's preparing me for something huge today? Well, we've got a lot of evidence coming up that he wasn't thinking about that at all. In fact, quite the contrary. So unlike the prophet Isaiah, who many years later would experience much the same thing, he experienced something very similar to this. Moses did not reply, "Here am I, send me." Now, a little break here before we get into what happens next. There's further symbolism of the burning bush. It has a threefold significance. It was a genuine picture of God, for it revealed His glory and power, yet it was not consumed. Moses needed to be reminded of the glory and power of God, for he was about to undertake an impossible task. The burning bush symbolized Israel going through the fire of affliction, but not consumed themselves. God's people were ultimately preserved through this whole thing. The burning bush illustrated Moses, a humble shepherd who, with God's help, will become a fire that could not be put out. Warren Wiersbe shares those thoughts with us. So, in verse 10, which we did not read, it said, "Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." That was the challenge that was offered to Moses. And then we have the next number of verses this is a give and take now between God and Moses about what was going to take place and how Moses responded to this. Verse 10, "I'm going to send you to Pharaoh, bring my people out." Moses did not immediately agree with God's plan to send him. He didn't exactly jump at the chance to assume leadership of a nation of slaves. This would be a monumental task, and he shrank from it. Moses raised 5 objections to his appointment. So, in this moment, he came up with five objections, like right off the cuff. And here's what he did. So let's read how he replied. Would someone read verses 11 through the end of the chapter? Verses 20. Well, let's read through the end of the chapter, verses 11 through 22. Do I have a volunteer? Okay, go for it. All right. Thank you so much. So, he raised 5 objections to his appointment. In these verses, we have heard 2 of the 5. 2 of the 5. Now, first thing he did is he pled lack of standing. He said, "Who am I? I'm nobody. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" The 40 years in the wilderness obviously had humbled Moses. He felt woefully inadequate. God responded to his objection with a twofold promise. So right off the bat, God hits him with twofold promise in response to this objection of Moses. First, the Lord promised to be with Moses. And that's enough, should be enough. The believer's source of power is not who he is, but who is with him. Second, God promised Moses success. He would bring the people out of Egypt to worship their God on Mount Sinai. Now, here's something I want to think about, that I want us to think about here. So, even though Moses objected and God made many promises and assurances to him, I want you to take note of the things that he didn't promise. Is there anything in this that we're going to see that God didn't promise to Moses? There you go. Was it easy for Moses? Were the people happy the whole time? Yeah, it was a piece of cake, right? Come on, everybody. Yay. Yeah, it was good the whole time. I mean, and then to the land flowing with milk and honey, to the land of the Canaanite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, and all that kind of stuff. So Moses probably knows kind of where that is, right? So in his mind, you kind of think, all right, so fellas, you like to plan in road trips and figure out, okay, someone says, well, we're going to go out west, and so we're going to go here, 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 and here. And you're already thinking, okay, it's going to take 10 and a half hours to get there. It's going to take, when we probably stay overnight, and then the next day we'll get another 8.5 hours down the road. And then it's probably going to take us, 10 days to do this. Isn't that how we think? Think maybe Moses thought that too? All right, so yeah, we're going to lead them, but maybe this will take 3 or 4 weeks, a month. We'll get everybody there. Think maybe that went through his head? Oh, probably it would have gone through mine. I mean, at some point, I'm like, when you start thinking of logistics, because I know, I'll just speak for me and my fellow fellers. That's kind of where our heads go. Logistics. How are we going to do this? And so, you think it ever crossed his mind it was going to be 40 years? Another 40 years of this? Do you think that even for, now, God didn't promise it would be easy here, did he? Paul? Okay, so there's a chance that his past, he might be afraid of his past trying to catch up to him. There still might be, his picture might still be on a wall, there somewhere, like at the post office. You know what I'm saying? That's a possibility. I'm sure that crosses mind. I'm not going back there. They might kill me on the spot. So I'm sure that probably those emotions and stuff probably flooded up to him. So, but God, there's certain things that God didn't promise here, but there are certain things that he did. So Moses cited he pleaded lack of standing. He also cited ignorance. If he were asked, he would not be able to tell the Israelites the name of God, of the God who was sending him. God answered this objection by telling Moses his name, I am. Now the statement, I am who I am, can be rendered a number of different ways in English. The statement, now this is interesting. Think about this for a minute. When you say I am, what is this indicating? Why is this significant? Always been? Always will be? It indicates, first of all, existence. Now, why would this, we're going to get into this a lot more once we get into the plagues. But think of the context about to which he's entering into, which was where? Back into Egypt. And so the name of God, the name of the God that is sent is I am, I exist. The one that is that this statement is emphasizing the timelessness of God. He is the self-existing one, the eternal, the one without beginning or end. The God of Israel's ancestors was to be identified by the name Yahweh, He who is. Most times in the Old Testament, in our English, in here, the word, the Lord, and especially if it's capitalized. But almost all the time, it's Yahweh. It's Yahweh. In fact, verse 15, where it says, the Lord, the God of your fathers, that's the word Yahweh. In verse 18, where it says, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, that's Yahweh. He who is. To be identified with Yahweh, he who is throughout the generations. Now you see two little asterisks there. This next section that follows this objection is that God is telling Moses what's going to go down. And so we're going to get to that after we get through these 5 objections. Paul? Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, they're kind of using it more in the sense that Popeye is, not Yahweh. But I mean, it is true. Yeah, but if that statement that someone is saying, this is who I am, deal with it, that's different than I exist. And so in the face of all these false gods who don't exist, the one who does exist, Yahweh, I am, that's who sent me. So, he pled lack of standing, he cited ignorance, he complained that he lacked credentials. So anytime anybody enters into an official situation, you always want to show your credentials, right? I mean, that goes for a lot of different places in life. So Moses feared that the people would not believe his claims regarding this encounter. In fact, this begins with chapter 4. Verse 1, it says, Then Moses answered and said, What if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, The Lord has not appeared to you. And the Lord said to him, What is that in your hand? And he said, Well, it's a staff. Then he said, Throw it on the ground. Now again, think about this. Just picture this for a second. Now I know some of you, this would be downright hilarious. Okay, so he's holding the staff. He's come to the wilderness. He sees a burning bush. He's still holding the staff through this whole discussion. And God says, What's that in your hand? It's a staff. He says, Throw it on the ground. Okay, I'll throw it on the ground. And then immediately it turns into a snake, a serpent. Okay, so it turns into a serpent. How did Moses respond to that? Well, that's pretty cool. What did it say he did? He fled. He ran. Now, be honest. How many of you, if that did, would you take off too? You'd just take off a running. Yeah. Yeah. Now, Molly would just take her shoe off and whack its head. Yeah. Yeah. For those of you that weren't here, one night there was a large spider that made its way over to where she was sitting, and she attacked that thing. You're my hero. So anyway, snakes. So he took off from it, right? So you can imagine he kind of gathers himself and comes back to this. And there's a serpent, his staff. But the Lord said to Moses, Stretch out your hand and grasp it by its tail. Again, picture this. Do you think it was kind of a little slow in getting to that tail? I know I would be. Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So he stretched out his hand and caught it and became a staff in his hand again. So you can imagine now he's holding this thing. He's probably like looking at it like, okay, let's not do that again anytime soon. Right? So he says, stretch out your hand and grasp it by its tail. So he stretched out his hand and caught it and became a staff. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. And the Lord furthermore said to him, Now put your hand into your bosom. So inside his cloak. It's covered up in there. And then pull it out. And he pulled it out, and it was covered, it was leprous, white. Now that would be a shock, right? You can imagine, this is not good. So he put his hand, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then he said, Put your hand in your bosom again. I'm sure he did this. So he put his hand And again, and when he took it out of his bosom, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Can you imagine the look on his face? And it shall come about that if they will not believe you or heed the witness of the first sign, that they may believe the witness of the last sign. But it shall be that if they not believe even these two signs or heed what you say, then you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water which you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. So, God responded by granting him 3 signs as proofs of his power. So he's given him 3 things here that he can do to show. These are things that he's going to be able to repeat again. In order to, these will be your credentials. Now, this is interesting. This pattern of credentialing God's prophet or God's messenger is going to be a pattern that happens throughout the rest of biblical history. So what is that pattern? Well, believe the message, but what is the pattern? There's things that are going to happen that God's setting up here a pattern. He's setting up a system, a way that things are going to happen moving forward throughout biblical history. Okay, so this was going to be something where he's providing these credentials through this pattern. So moving forward, when someone's performing a miracle, it's not just like, hey, come look, this is fun. You know, it's not just for the sake of doing the miracle. Okay, that's something that we always need to remember, and it's something we talked about in great deal in our miracle study and our men's Bible study on Tuesday mornings at 9:30. We're currently studying the Holy Spirit, so you need to come. But when we studied miracles, every one, it was because it was to credential the message or the messenger. It was to provide proof that those who would be witnessing certain things and also hearing the words of one who would now speak. It's to credential the message or the messenger. This would be something that would happen throughout biblical history. It's absolutely tied to authority. Credentials and authority. Absolutely. So, we see these 3 things here would be his credentials. So, then in verse 11, Moses says, all right, I'm good. You convince me. I've got what I need. Is that what he said? No. And the Lord said to him, who has made man's... let me back up. Verse 10. Then Moses said to the Lord right after this, please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither recently nor in times past, nor since thou hast spoken to thy servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth, or who makes him dumb or deaf, or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now then go, and I, even I, will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to say. So he called attention to his lack of ability. Moses described himself as slow of speech and tongue. He did not regard himself as an orator. And God responded that he was in ultimate control of man's communication faculties. He just witnessed these 3 miracles, or 2 of the 3. The third one was there if he needed it. Certainly God could help him with what to say. God responded that he was in ultimate control. He promised to help Moses speak to and teach him what to say. Now, here's something interesting. During this encounter, Moses addressed God twice in verse 10 and verse 13. But in neither case did he use the name which God had revealed to him. He would eventually. But right here off the bat, as he's kind of trying to run away from all this, he doesn't really address God even the way that God just said, here's my name, this is what you need to use. And at this point, as he's continuing to find reasons not to, he failed to remember those little facts of what he'd just been told by God. And then in verse 12, or verse 13, But he said, please, Lord, now send the message by whomever thou wilt. That's a really wordy way of saying anybody but me. Can you find somebody else, please? Surely there's somebody better equipped than I. He pled with God to send someone else. This unwillingness to serve angered the Lord. So finally we see that God's anger, verse 14, then the anger of the Lord burned against Moses, and he said, is there not your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he speaks fluently, and moreover, behold, he's coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in your heart. So now God says, your brother Aaron, he's very proficient in speech, and he's coming to see you. Now, again, is this significant? Had they just had Sunday dinner together? He's not seen him in forever. Now, just for a moment, think about that. He says, Aaron the Levite, can you pick what? Him? I haven't seen him in forever. And then he says, he's eloquent, and he's coming out to see you. And when he sees you, he's going to be happy. It's not going to be a bad thing. See, what could Moses worry about his brother not seeing him in 40 years? What would he naturally worry about? Would he be remembered? Would he be angry? Would he want to, why did you do this? But he's coming. He's a good speaker. And I'm going to get to see him, and he's going to be happy. That's pretty cool. Verse 15. And you are to speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I, even I, will be with your mouth and his mouth, and I will teach you what you are to do. So God takes us one step farther. He says, I can deal with you individually, but I'm going to give you somebody pretty special to help you. Moreover, he shall speak for you to the people, and it shall come about that he shall be as a mouth for you, and you shall be as God to him. Okay, we'll talk about this here for a minute, because this is, what in the world does this mean? What does this mean? That Aaron would worship Moses? Okay, so typically what he's laying out here is a structure of authority. Okay, so Aaron's going to be right there, and in fact, there'll be many times when Aaron's doing a lot of the talking, and a lot of times the one who does a lot of the talking is the one who people might look to. Right? But God's telling Aaron right off the bat, and telling Moses right off the bat, that Moses is going to be the leader, the representation of God upon earth here. So he would serve as Moses' mouth. Moses, however, would be as God to Aaron, i.e., he would be the ultimate human leader of the nation. With his staff, he would be able to perform miraculous signs, and that staff would be his symbol of authority. Here's something else that occurred to me. Think about this for a minute. Any of you ever lost your phone? Anybody here, you ever left it behind? Am I the only one? You ever lost your wallet or your purse? Left it behind somewhere? How's that feel in that time when it's gone? Oh, it's a panic attack, right? Right? Okay, you think there was ever a time when Moses was like, where's my staff? Think about that for a minute. Yeah, like if he just misplaced it for a second. Right? Like and then he's like, because what does this say? I mean, this staff's going to be his symbol of power and authority. If just for a minute, I've been picturing this whole thing as I've been thinking about this. And you think about what was portrayed in the Ten Commandments and stuff. I mean, you could have a couple lighthearted moments that you could add in here about about that he left it somewhere and had to go find. Yeah, of course that's. Yeah, slithered away. Yeah. Now, going back in the middle of all this, where those two asterisks were, I put that over here because this is pulled out here. God, in the middle of all this, tells Moses everything that's going to happen. After answering Moses' protest of ignorance regarding the divine name, so after God tells Moses, I am is who's sending me, right? Then he says these things. God outlines the entire campaign against Egypt. First, Moses was to go to the elders of Israel and tell them that God had appeared to him. He was to communicate God's concern and God's promise to bring them out. Second, the elders were then to go to Pharaoh to announce the appearance of God. They were to request permission to make a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to him. And it said that Pharaoh would not listen. He would reject their request. Third, God would smite Egypt with wonders and miraculous judgments. And fourth, before they left Egypt, the Israelites would plunder Egypt. This confirms the promise made to Abraham. And if you go back and read that in Genesis 15:14, it says that they would plunder, right? And the God of Israel would triumph so thoroughly over Egypt that women and children would carry away the spoils. Now that's significant because it kind of gives the image in the way that it's written that as they're heading their way out, they're just like, take our stuff and get out of here. Have whatever you want. Just leave. That's complete devastation in what had happened. And that's what was going to happen. Again, we could speak of this as proleptically. All right. Because it's going to happen. All right. So God assures Moses. Now, this is where I told you earlier that things there's a place here where things take a weird turn. It's probably something you weren't aware of. Not pleasant. All right. So Moses, verses 18 through 31 of chapter 4. So, after all this happened, in verse 17, and you shall take in your hand this staff, which you shall perform the signs. Then it says, then Moses departed and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go, that I may return to my brethren who are in Egypt, and see if they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. Just think about that for a minute. We'll come back to that. Left out a couple details. So, now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, let's just talk about that right now. Why did Moses, did he lie? He didn't lie. But he left out some significant details. Why do you think he left out some significant details? Well, he was priest. We think he was a worshiper of Yahweh. Still trying to wrap his head around it. Might not believe him. Nope. He's not met up with Aaron in the wilderness yet. Sure. But why didn't he tell him everything? Why did he just say, I want to go see if my family's alive, my brothers are alive? What's that? Okay. Okay. Is there any chance at this point that leave out a few details and you just want to go see if your family's alive? I think you need to stay here. You think there was anything in Moses that was saying, if I don't tell him the whole story, maybe he'll just make me stay? And then I can't disobey him. Now, if he was a priest of God, of Yahweh, if in that sense, if we talk about Jethro was a worshiper, and he did say, look, the Lord spoke to me in a bush, and this, that, and the other, and if that was the case, then maybe he's like, look, you got to go now. I tend to lean towards the fact that probably he was still trying to find a way out. But you guys all bring up good possibilities. Well, that's a possibility too. But then again, he had some things that he could do to prove himself. He had a staff that he knew, he had his hand, and he had the Nile, which he would use. So, verse 19. Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. Okay, so that takes away one of the things that could be problematic. He's, okay. So Moses took his wife and his sons and mounted them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt. Moses also took the staff of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Okay. Now, I want you to notice something here. God just added a little something to the stakes. What did he add? No. Why was he performing these signs and wonders to begin with? Well, who's Moses thinking I got to convince first? He didn't say anything about me having to go stand before Pharaoh. Wait, what? I got to do this in front of him? I thought I just had to convince the elders we'll just mount up a rebellion and leave. Now I got to go stand before him? Verse 22, then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But behold, you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. So now what does Moses know? What's that? Yeah, he knows the result of this. Yep. This is going to end in Pharaoh's firstborn being killed. He knows that's going to happen. Now, this is where it takes a turn. Now, it came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Say what? Who him? Verse 24. Now it came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses' feet. And she said, you are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. At that time she said, you are a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. Okay, this was me confessing to you, I don't remember this at all. This was not in the movie. I'm thankful for that, but... All right, I'm going to read to you what Doc Smith says about this. So, God disciplined Moses through deathly sickness to remind him of his obligations. Deathly sickness to his son. Why? Because God, the designated leader of God's people, had neglected to circumcise his youngest son. So what they believe is happening here is that the youngest son, because he wasn't circumcised, was caused to be deathly ill by God as a punishment. And so in reaction to this, Zipporah did what she did to stop what was happening. She believed it was because of that. Yeah, but this is interesting. So God disciplined Moses through the deathly sickness to remind him of his obligations. A leader must set things right in his own household. This narrative contains a warning for every Israelite. Even the great prophet Moses cannot get by with failing to circumcise his son. The reason for her husband's jeopardy was immediately perceived by Zipporah to save the life of her husband. I misspoke. She took a flint knife and grudgingly circumcised her son. So the him here in verse 24 is Moses. Just as shrewd action by Rachel saved Jacob from Laban's wrath, so alert action by Zipporah saved Moses from God's wrath. Now, her disgust at the rite of circumcision, so maybe Moses didn't do it because of her. Her disgust at the rite of circumcision, however, is clear. She seems to have returned to her father's house after this incident. Okay, so this is a big deal. This is a big deal. Why is this a big deal? Yeah, that's been set in place for years, but why is this personally a big deal to Moses? I mean, he's decided to kind of go, and he's going. He's got his wife and children with him. Then this happens, deathly ill. To stop this, Zipporah does this, throws this at his feet, and says what she says twice, you're a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. And Smith here believes that she's gone now. Right. Now this is a tragic moment for him. I mean, this had to be something hard for him to experience. His wife now has left him. It's what Doc Smith thinks. It's not mentioned moving forward, and we know that eventually he takes a Cushite wife. Go ahead. That's what it says. Well, yes. He had two sons. So one apparently had been circumcised, but the other hadn't. Okay. So you're familiar with this. Yeah, so there was a real correction here, and it looked like it cost him his wife, too, in this. Now the Lord, verse 27, things take a turn for the better. Now the Lord said to Aaron, go to meet Moses in the wilderness. So he went and met with him on the mountain of God, and he kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord which he had sent him, and all the signs that he had commanded him to do so. Then Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the sons of Israel. And Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. He then performed the signs in the sight of the people. So the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord was concerned about the sons of Israel, that he had seen their affliction, then they bowed low and worshipped. So the first part of what was told to Moses is now taking place. So there are 5 things here that we see. Moses had God's word, the miraculous signs, and the assistance of his brother Aaron, yet these verses make it clear that he still was not fully ready to walk by faith. 5 factors, however, reinforce Moses' reluctant decision to accept the divine challenge. First, Moses received no protest from his father-in-law when he requested to return to Egypt. Moses, however, as we talked about, did not reveal to Jethro his full purpose. As he set out the second thing for Egypt with his wife and sons, plural, received a further revelation from the Lord. Moses was to perform his wonders not just before Israel, but before Pharaoh as well. God would harden Pharaoh's heart. He would not release Israel, God's firstborn son, and so the Lord would slay the firstborn of the king. Thus, at the very outset, Moses knew the final outcome of his confrontation with Pharaoh. Then Moses received divine discipline, which we just talked about. And Moses met with Aaron in the wilderness. This joyous reunion fulfilled the earlier promise we saw in chapter 4, verse 4:15. His brother believed all that Moses told him about what had transpired on the mount. And then they met before the elders. The he there in verse 30, Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. I guess there's some debate about this, but then he then performed the signs inside the people. Clearly, to me, that's Moses. Moses. I don't think we have any indication at this point that Aaron's doing anything like that. So, the signs, no doubt, were those described in 4:3-9, which we talked about. Hearing of the compassion which God had for them, the people bowed down and worshiped. So, we have Moses setting out, being called through his encounter with the burning bush, and now things are happening. Any questions or comments about anything we've covered tonight? Yeah. And everything that happened. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was probably, would have been something to see. Something to experience personally for sure. Yep. Amazing to think about.